The following program is brought to you by Caltech.
Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all to the second lecture of the 2016 Everhart Lecture Series. My name is Konstantin, and I am the chair of the Everhart Committee. The Everhart Lecture Series is a program funded by the Graduate Office and supported by the Graduate Student Council. It is a forum which encourages interdisciplinary interactions among students and faculty and recognizes the exemplary presentation and research abilities of Caltech's graduate students. Each fall, 3 lectures are selected by an interdisciplinary committee of fellow graduate students based on their dynamic speaking skills, their ability to communicate their research field's broader importance, and their impact on the scientific community. As you all know, Caltech has an abundance of outstanding graduate students who have all of these qualities, and choosing just 3 from each year's candidates is certainly no easy task. Thankfully, we have managed to select our lecturers this year, and the second of this truly exceptional group is Nikolai Matni from the Department of Computing and Mathematical Sciences. At this point, I would like to ask Professor John Doyle to come up and introduce Nikolai.
So in principle, I was his thesis advisor. He just finished his PhD, but he's really been always much more of a colleague. And so I've never had to do anything before this, except now I get to introduce him. So it's fun to introduce him for this. So I'm going to just give a few vignettes that I know from his biography. So he was from Montreal originally. He was an undergrad in British Columbia, University of British Columbia, and apparently he took some classes and did some research and wrote some papers. But I think his claim to fame there was as the star goalie of the national champion, what we call soccer team. And he got lots of personal awards as well, but I think he's a team player, and I think he probably is most proud of the national championship. And so now his pro career never took off because of injuries, and so Caltech was plan B. So soccer's loss was our gain. So I can relate to that. Caltech was my plan D. Anyway, because the whole Hollywood thing just didn't work out. Anyway, so I would say another highlight was in his third year as a graduate student, after getting more or less no direction from me other than look at this wide frontier, he finally figured out some problem and did some research and wrote a paper and won the Student Prize Paper Award that year in the top controls conference. And he was the sole author on the paper. And really deserved to be. He did all the research, did all the writing. I sort of followed the proof, but didn't really help. And so, but that had never happened before. Not only in the 50-year history of the conference had there never been a student win a prize paper award as the only author, you couldn't even nominate him because it never occurred to anyone that a student would have a paper that wasn't co-authored by their advisor. So you had to even nominate him, you had to be a co-author and his advisor, which was the empty set. And so we actually had to hack the website to get him even nominated. But he did win, and so those are a couple, I think, things that highlight both his independence and initiative, but also his diversity of talents. So hopefully you'll hear another dimension of his diverse talents now.
Thank you very much for that introduction, John. Thank you, Konstantin, for introducing me as well. So today, I'll be telling you about work that I've been doing along with fellow grad students in John Doyle's group towards developing a theory, developing a set of mathematical guidelines of how you should build and control complex interconnected systems. Now, the main purpose of today's talk is going to be to introduce some core concepts from a branch of applied mathematics known as control theory, and to show you how these tools can be used to gain deep insight into both natural systems and to understand how we should design technological ones. Now, before diving into that, the first thing I need to explain to all of you is exactly what I mean by a complex interconnected system. Fortunately, these days, we don't have to look too far to find complexity. So for instance, if any of you drove into work this morning, well, then you were in a car that's controlled by over 50 different microcontrollers. So a lot of complexity under the hood there. Staying with the theme of transportation, if you've taken a plane recently, if you've been on a Boeing 747 to, say, fly to a conference, then you're on an aircraft that has over 170 miles worth of wiring interconnecting all of its different components. Now, the very fact that I'm in this room and the lights are on and the projector is working is because we have power delivered to us in a reliable way with an electric distribution system that provides power to 125 million different homes, drawing on power and energy produced by thousands of power plants and base stations. All of these pictures that I'm showing you here, well, I downloaded them from the internet, a network of networks consisting of billions of nodes interacting and exchanging information with each other. Now, what I've presented to you here are a collection of technological systems that I think we can all agree are complex, but we certainly don't have a monopoly on complexity. If we look to the natural world, something even as seemingly simple as a single-cell bacteria such as E. coli, its behavior arises due to the interaction and coordination of thousands of genes and proteins. And then finally, my favorite example of a complex system is, well, it's all of you and it's me. It's the human nervous system, composed of about 100 billion neurons that trigger muscle contractions and other processes throughout the body across about 100,000 miles worth of axons. Now, you may be looking at all of these different systems and wondering, okay, these are really different. A car is very different from a bacteria. They're built in different ways. They do different things. How am I going to come up with a theory that explains equally how a bacteria works and tells me how I should design a car? That's a fair question. But the insight here is that if you zoom out and look at all of these systems at the right level of abstraction, well, then they share a common set of key properties that allow us to talk about them as a whole. Of course, when we want to study a specific system, we're going to want to zoom in and plug in domain-specific details to gain even further insight. But there's still a lot of value and insight to be gained by looking at these systems at this abstract level. So what are these common key characteristics? Well, I think the first thing to notice is that these are all large-scale and heterogeneous systems. They're composed of a large number of different subcomponents, and these different subcomponents and subsystems are generally different. They're, of course, also interconnected, and they're dynamic. And it's this interconnection and dynamic interaction of different subsystems that are pushing and pulling on each other in large numbers that leads to seemingly complex behavior. But you'll notice that all of these systems that I described earlier in this previous slide, despite this complexity, have very predictable behavior. So despite the interconnection, the dynamic interaction of all these different subsystems, from a user's point of view, their behavior is predictable, and the complexity is hidden. So for instance, if I go to flick a light switch on in a room, I don't have to worry about this complicated power grid behind the scenes. If I go to stream Netflix on my laptop, I don't have to worry about this complicated network behind the scenes. But when things go wrong, that's when all of a sudden I become very aware of the fact that there's complexity behind the scenes. So when there's a power outage and I go to turn on a light and it doesn't work, all of a sudden I'm aware there's this complicated electrical distribution system. When I go to stream Netflix and it just doesn't work and it starts lagging and buffering at my favorite part of the show, I'm very aware that there's this complicated network behind the scenes. And when my legs give out of me at the gym and I fall on my face, I realize that my body is maybe not as predictable as I'd like it to be. And so these failures are actually going to be the starting point for our theory. And we could argue that these failures occur because in all of these instances, we don't understand the fundamental limits of what these systems can handle. What I'm going to explain to you in the next few slides is how these fundamental limits arise due to inherent trade-offs that we have to explore when we're designing an engineered system. So we've been talking about this in terms of broad kind of abstract concepts. So let's dive into something a little bit more specific and something that I think everybody can relate to. So let's think about what goes into designing a car. Now, for instance, if I design a car, I might want it to be fast. You know, fast cars are fun to drive, they look cool. But at the same time, speed isn't everything. Sometimes you have to be a little bit responsible in life. And so maybe you want your car to be safe as well. And so if you look at these two pictures, I think at this point it should be pretty clear that there's going to be some kind of trade-off between how fast I can be and how safe I can be at the same time. So let's make this a little bit more explicit. Let's make this graphically visual. So I'm going to plot these two cars in what I'm going to call the fast, safe design space. So on this horizontal axis here, I have safety. So the farther out to the right I am, the safer I am. On the vertical axis, I have the speed of my car, the fastness. And so the higher up I am, the faster I am. Ideally, I want to be way out here. I want to be incredibly fast and incredibly safe. So think of, I don't know, a tank with a rocket booster strapped to it or something. But we can't reach that ideal level. And why is that? Well, typically when you go to build a car, there's going to be some sort of fixed budget. And this fixed budget, the fixed amount of resources that I have, is going to impose a fundamental trade-off in terms of how simultaneously fast and how simultaneously safe I can be. Now, if I have less money, this trade-off curve goes down. If I have more, it moves up. But it remains true that there is some fundamental limit. Now, of course, this is a gross oversimplification of what goes into designing a car. We could also worry about, say, fuel efficiency, or handling, or having a smooth ride. And all of these trade-off curves extend into this higher dimensional, more complicated design space. But even if we just focus on being fast and safe, we have to figure out how to explore this design space in the right way. Now, how do we explore a design space? Well, we're going to pick our parts, we're going to build a car, and then we're going to program it in some way. And we want to be sure that we program it and build it in the right way so that we end up somewhere on this curve. So say, I want a BMW that trades off nicely between being fast and safe. And the reason we want to make sure that we end up on this curve and not off of it with a lemon is because if we're not on this curve, somehow we're wasting our resources. Now, what I'm going to show you today is how tools from control theory can be used to explore this design space in an efficient way when one of these axes is safety, or as we like to call it in the control theory world, robustness. So before diving into how we can use these tools, I have to explain to you what control theory even is. Now, control theory is this amazing branch of applied mathematics that nobody knows about, but it's an enabling technology in really anything in the modern world. Cars wouldn't work without it, airplanes wouldn't work without it, the power grid would constantly go down, and the internet would grind to a screeching halt. So one of the main points of what I want to do today is explain to you what it is. If I was going to describe it to you in a single sentence, it would be the use of feedback to mitigate the effects of dynamic uncertainty on a system. Now, this probably doesn't mean a whole lot to some of you, so what I want to do is go through a simple toy example to illustrate the core concepts and also introduce some terminology that we're going to be using throughout the talk. So the core element, the core object of study in control theory is the plant. And this is just the system that we're trying to control. So for our little example, this is going to be an airplane. Once I'm given this plant, I have to specify a set point. Now, a set point is just a nominal operating condition, a nominal state of being for this system that is desirable. So in the case of this aircraft, think of something like a flat pitch and no pitch rate. So this gives me a nice smooth ride through the air. And now suppose that I have access to an exquisitely accurate model of my airplane. And so I can compute exactly how I should adjust engine thrust and wing flaps to get myself from, say, Los Angeles to New York. That's all great, but there's always going to be some component in the environment, what we call disturbances, that we just can't model. So even if I have this great model and I compute this great trajectory, if I let this system run in what's called open loop, then a small gust of wind might send my aircraft all over the place. And so control theory is about mitigating the effects of these uncertain disturbances in the environment. And we do this by closing a feedback loop. So how do we do that? The first thing we do is attach some sensors to our aircraft. So in this case, you could think of something like a gyroscope or an accelerometer or an altimeter. These sensors provide measurements to a controller. And this controller is really the brains of the operation. This controller uses the measurements and the set point, as well as a dynamic model of the aircraft. So think of the equations of motion describing how an aircraft would move, to compute a control action. This control action is then applied via what we call actuators. So in this case, this would simply be engine thrust and wing flaps, for instance. But in general, an actuator is just a way that we can affect the state of a system. And now we're going to use feedback to close the loop. And the goal here is to lead to some sort of desirable behavior, some desirable property of our system. So in this case, you could think of something like being robust to these disturbances. Now, a common notion of desirable behavior in the context of control theory is that of a stabilizing controller. So a stabilizing controller is just one that guarantees that if I give my system a knock away from a desired set point, I eventually come back there. Now, although this is a very useful tool, it's not always enough, especially in the context of systems that humans are interacting with. So let me give you an example of two stabilizing controllers in the context of an aircraft. And I think it'll be pretty clear to you that one is much more preferable than the other. So the first controller, which I'm going to call the first class controller, is one where if I give my airplane a little gust, it moves a little bit, but then it comes back. So this is a nice controller. Now I'm going to show you another stabilizing controller, which I'm going to call the lose your lunch controller. This is also stabilizing. I come back to where I started eventually, but my lunch may not have made it. So we're going to want to be able to distinguish between these two controllers somehow. We're going to want to formalize this notion of goodness. And the way we're going to do this is by measuring the goodness, by ranking controllers according to their ability to minimize the amplification of a disturbance on the system. And so we're going to capture the amplification with I'm going to introduce a little bit of math here. We're going to capture this amplification with a function f. This f is going to assign a number to the error of my system, so how I evolve away from this set point, my control action, u, and my disturbance, w. So given these three components, f will just tell me how much the disturbance was amplified. And then with this cost function, I can talk about finding the u, the control action, that minimizes the disturbance amplification. So this is the idea of optimal control theory. Now you may be looking at this and thinking, wait, hang on a second. You just went through this whole story telling me that I need feedback because I don't know what this disturbance is ahead of time. And now here I have it as a part of my cost function, as a part of my optimization problem. That's absolutely correct. So the way we get around this in control theory is we only concern ourselves with disturbances living within a certain model class. So for instance, I could ask that I could only consider disturbances of, say, bounded energy. So I could only worry about, say, wind gusts that have a certain amount of energy. Or disturbances of a bounded magnitude. So suppose I'm designing a suspension system for a car. Then this might be a good way to model bumps in the road. Now, once I have a model class where my disturbances live, I can meaningfully talk about minimizing the worst case amplification. Right? So I can make sure that my system behaves well for any such disturbance within this model class. Now, sometimes this worst case approach doesn't make sense, especially if, say, my disturbance is better modeled by white noise. And we can talk about, say, minimizing the average amplification or the expected value of this cost function. But for today, we're really going to focus on this idea of minimizing worst case behavior. And the reason we're going to focus on this is because it allows us to identify fundamental limits of robustness. And this is going to play a key part in how we're going to be able to explore these design trade-offs. So again, let me give you a specific example in the context of this little aircraft example. Excuse me. Suppose that I have a safe region that I'm going to denote with this blue rectangle, and I want to make sure that my aircraft stays in the safe region despite any disturbance. Using the techniques that I described in the previous slide, I can ensure that, say, any wind gust of this size, which I'm going to denote with a green rectangle, will be such that my aircraft remains in this green rectangle here. Likewise, for a larger disturbance, which I'm going to denote with this red rectangle, I can guarantee that I stay within this red rectangle. Well, it should be clear here, then, if blue is my safe region, I'm robust to any green wind gust, any one of these smaller wind gusts, but there exists a red or large wind gust that knocks me out of it. And so you can imagine that, or I hope you can appreciate that, the ability to be robust, to be able to understand these fundamental limits, is key in being able to guarantee predictable behavior and keeping the complexity of these systems hidden. Indeed, if we think about all these failures that I described earlier, they can all be thought of as arising because there was a certain lack of robustness or a certain fragility to these systems that we did not identify beforehand. So if we can understand these fundamental limits and be able and identify where the fragility lies in the system, then we know where we should devote extra hardware resources, extra security, extra surveillance to ensure that these disturbances are actually suppressed. Okay. So what we just did was a whirlwind tour of control theory, and I highlighted, at least at a high level, how we can think about using tools from control theory to explore trade-offs, in particular trade-offs between performance and robustness. Now what I want to do now is show you how these ideas, combined with simple models from neuroscience, from physiological models, can actually be used to reverse engineer design principles behind the human nervous system. Now, this is joint work with Yori Nakahira, who's here today. She's the lead author of this work, as well as my advisor, John Doyle. Now, before diving into this, I just want to remind everybody what it means to reverse engineer a system. So suppose I'm just given some black box and told to reverse engineer it. What do I need to do? Well, the first thing I need to do is just figure out what the box does. What does it do? So in the case of the human nervous system, we've got a leg up. We kind of already know what it does. It's meant to measure the environment and allow us to react to it. The next level of reverse engineering a system is understanding what the design specifications for the system were. Why was the system designed the way it was? And then finally, we have to understand the environmental context that led to these design specifications. And so these are the three questions that I want you to keep in mind as we go through this next part of the talk. So this is now the interactive part of the talk. So we're going to start with a quiz. Now I'm going to describe a couple of tasks. I don't want you to do anything until I tell you to, though, because I'm going to describe some tasks, we're going to have a quiz, and then we're going to do an experiment. So the two tasks are, so the first task is I want you to put your hand in front of your face and then look at the lines on your hand and figure out how quickly you can move your hand back and forth without the lines blurring. Don't do it yet. Don't do it yet. No, I see all of you waving your hands. Told you not to do it yet. Okay, so that's task one. Then task two is you're going to hold your hand in front of your head, in front of your face again, look at the lines, but this time shake your head and figure out which one you can do faster. Right? And so what I want to ask you all is, which one do you think you can do faster? Can I shake my hand without the lines blurring, or my head without the lines blurring faster? So who votes for moving my hand? Put your hands up. Okay, about half of you. And then who votes for moving your head? Okay. Okay, now try it. Great, okay, so I love how trusting you all are. I have the whole room doing this. You have no idea why. Okay, so if you did this properly and you didn't do both at the same time, then you would have seen that you could move your hand slower than you can move your head. You could actually shake your head quite quickly without the lines blurring. And so the question now is, why? And so we're going to do this, we're going to answer this question by looking at simple physiological models of these two systems. So let's start with the slow system. So I'm just going to tease this apart a little bit, and I'm going to plug in a slightly more detailed model. And so what I want you to think of in this system as the disturbance is my hand moving. Right? My hand moves. My eye is my sensor. It provides hand position information to my brain, which you could think of as the controller here. My brain will do some sort of computation to determine a muscle contraction in the back of my eye. This is my actuator, to move my eye to follow my hand. And so the question is, given this very simple model, what's the bottleneck? What's limiting how quickly I can move my hand? Now to do this, we're going to focus on to answer this question, we're going to focus on the means of communication between my sensors and my controllers and my actuators, and those are the nerves. And in order to do this, we're going to have to introduce a simple model of a nerve. The way I want you to think about a nerve today is as a bundle of axons. So each axon I want you to think of as a wire along which I can transmit information. I can transmit electrical spikes. And we're going to characterize a nerve in terms of two quantities. One is going to be its speed. And it's the speed of a nerve you should think of as scaling with the axon diameter. So the fatter my axon, the faster I can transmit information. And then we're also going to characterize a nerve in terms of its resolution. So you can think of a nerve being more accurate as having more resolution if it has more axons within a nerve. And so if we're going to model a nerve this way, and our friends in neuroscience tell us that this makes sense for at least a large number of nerves within our body, then you can think of a nerve really as an analog to digital converter. So suppose that I'm given this signal here that I want to transit to a muscle. Well, I have to feed it through a nerve, and then depending on how this nerve is built, the output will change. So suppose I have only a few axons in my nerve. Then this means that the output will be a coarse representation of the input. If I put more axons in, then I get a more accurate, a finer resolution representation of my input at the output. Likewise, if I have fat axons, then the information is transmitted quickly. And if I have thin axons, well, then the information is transmitted more slowly. Okay, so if you believe me that this is at least a reasonable way to model a nerve, the next thing we need to understand are the types of trade-offs that arise when we're going to build one. Just as in the context of a car, we had a trade-off between being fast and safe, in a nerve, we have a trade-off that arises between being fast and accurate. Now recall that when it comes to a trade-off, one of the key components that are required for there to actually be a limit, for there to be a trade-off, is a notion of budget. Excuse me. So in the context of a nerve, the right notion of budget, the right notion of cost, is the area of the nerve. And so we're going to fix the area of our nerve to be 2 millimeters today. The reason this makes sense as a notion of budget is because the amount of energy it costs to build and maintain a nerve within the body scales proportionally with its area. And so you can think of the area as a good measure of the cost of building and maintaining one. So at one extreme of this trade-off space, I can put just one big axon within my 2 millimeter nerve. This means I'm transmitting as quickly as possible, but I only essentially get one bit of information. I can say on or off. Now, at the other extreme of this trade-off space, this is actually where we find our optic nerve, the nerve that we use for vision. The optic nerve has approximately 10 to the 6 axons, so it's very accurate, but it's not very fast. So this component level study of this system gives us an answer. The bottleneck here is vision. Vision is slow. Okay. That at least gives us a component level explanation for the observation that we made earlier with our experiment. Now let's look at our other model, the head shaking model. Again, we're just going to tease things apart. And now I'm going to do something a little weird here, and then I'm going to draw the eye outside of the head. And the only reason I'm doing this way is to make explicit the fact that I'm not using vision to detect anything. I actually have a completely different system to detect the disturbance of my head shaking, and I need to stabilize my eye in spite of a head shaking. So this is something known as the vestibular ocular reflex, and it's a completely dedicated system to stabilizing vision as we move. So the VOR nerve is going to provide head position information to the VOR, which will then compute a controlled action to stabilize the nerve, to stabilize the eye on the hand despite my head shaking. This is the reason you can go for a run and your vision doesn't blur. And so if we look at where this vestibular nerve lies on this trade-off space, we see that it's composed of less axons. So it's faster at the expense of being slightly less accurate. And so again, we have an answer now as to why we can shake our head faster than we can move our hand. Our VOR system is fast. Okay, so you may be thinking, okay, great, we're done. Well, we're not. Right? Recall, the questions that we're looking to answer here is to understand the deeper reasons as to why our nervous system is built this way. So great, our optic nerve has 10 to the 6 axons. Our vestibular nerve has 10 to the 4. But why? Why was it built that way? And more generally, if we look at the distribution of axon diameter and axons per nerve in our body, so on the horizontal axis, I have the mean axon diameter. And so you can think of something out to the right here as being fast. And on the vertical axis, I have the number of axons per nerve. So something higher up here you can think of as being accurate. And if I just show where different nerves associated with different senses and motion and sensory motor components lie, we see there's a huge range. In terms of accuracy, for instance, we range across 6 orders of magnitude. So again, what we'd like to answer is why? Why is there such heterogeneity in the distribution of axon size and axon speed? In order to answer this question, we're going to have to look at things at a systemic level as opposed to at a component level. So this is where control theory is going to come into play. So we can think about optimal ocular control. How do we optimally control our eye? In this case, the plant is going to be the position of our eye. So I'm going to use x of t to denote where my eye should be looking. So nominally, I want x of t to be equal to 0. And its dynamics are going to be very simple. If I don't do anything, if nothing's happening, where my eye is looking now is where my eye is looking at the next time instant. That's all that this says. Then I'm going to call my muscle contraction my input to the system. I'm going to use u of t to label that. And its effects on the dynamics are as follows. So if I apply an input u of t, it lets me move my eye one direction or another. And then finally, I have to model my disturbance. So this is either my hand moving or my head shaking, depending on the system that we're studying. And I'm going to call that w of t. And again, this just enters my error position in this simple way. Now, the last thing missing from this model is the idea of a nerve model. We talked about that at great length just now. So the first thing we're going to do is recall that we characterize a nerve in terms of its resolution r, as well as its delay t. And so I'm going to incorporate these in the model in this way. I'm just going to rewrite u of t as such. And you should just think of this as my continuous signal u of t passing through this analog to digital converter that is a nerve. Given these dynamics, I can then talk about minimizing the worst case amplification, the worst case error due to head motion or handshaking. Right? I can pose this optimal control problem. Now, in the context of this system, we can actually solve this problem analytically. So this is really nice. We get a really nice clean formula. So what is this formula telling me? The first thing that we see is that delay hertz. The longer it takes me to detect a disturbance, the longer it takes me to detect hand motion or head shaking, the worse my cost. And this is intuitive, right? If I have a disturbance and I don't get to detect it until a little bit after it happens, then maybe I can't do as good a job at suppressing it. What we also see is that bigger R, more resolution, also helps. Again, this is intuitive. This makes sense. If I can see my disturbance better, if I have more information about it, then I can do a better job of suppressing its effect on the system. Now, if I was just looking at this cost and I wasn't thinking about the trade-offs underneath a nerve, then the right thing to do here is simply to set t equal to 0, 0 delay, and to take R off to infinity. So I have infinite resolution with 0 delay. But we can't do that. Remember, there is a trade-off here between being fast and accurate given a fixed area, nerve area. Again, speaking to our neuroscience friends, they tell us that an appropriate, at least first-order model for this trade-off is just to say that my resolution R scales proportionally with my delay t. And I'm going to use lambda a here to denote this proportionality constant. Now, if you don't like this model, you can actually plug in something more complicated and all these ideas go through, just the results will change. Okay, so recall this is our setup, our dynamics are here, and this is our system. And this is the optimal cost that we achieve. This is the best worst case amplification of my disturbance. We're going to plug in our nerve model, so I'm going to replace R here with lambda of t, lambda t. So now I have an expression that's just a function of t. So I can tune my nerve as a function of this parameter, as a function of its delay. So let's plot how this cost changes as I vary t from 0 up to something big, here 10 in this case. So there are 3 curves on this plot. The first is due to my resolution error. And so you see that as my delay increases, I am able to get more information, I have higher resolution. And so the penalty due to resolution error decreases. Similarly, if I look at the effect of delay, this is denoted by this red line, then I see as my delay gets bigger, my performance gets worse. And then the black line here is just the sum of these 2 terms. And it should be clear that there's a sweet spot that optimally trades off between delay and resolution in the context of this model. Okay, so that's pretty cool. But does it really answer the question that we set out to answer? Not really, right? This would suggest that we should have all of our nerves would have the same distribution of axons and axon diameter and axons per nerve. But rather, we see heterogeneity. So whenever this happens, when there's a mismatch between what the theory predicts and what we see in experiment, what we observe in nature, we have to go back and figure out what we missed in our model. So in this context, what I'm going to claim we're missing in our model is the distinction between the types of disturbances we detect with vision and those that we detect with reflex. So when I'm using vision, I typically get advanced warning of a disturbance coming towards me. Whereas when I'm using reflexes, I don't get an advanced warning. I actually get delayed detection. So let's make this a little bit more clear with the aid of a more visual example, where I have here on the left some road cyclists in the Tour de France, and on the right, I have people who are doing mountain biking. So on the left, we're using vision to steer. So we're seeing the curve in the road. You should think of that as the disturbance. And I get a lot of advanced warning. In contrast, on the right, the main component of disturbance rejection here is really reacting to these bumps in the road, making sure that I don't fall despite the bumps on the trail. And so there, I don't get to see the bump coming ahead of time. It's really, I only know that there's a bump after it hits me. And so this is really what I mean by the difference between advanced warning, where I see what's coming, compared to delayed detection, where I only feel something after it hits me. So let's incorporate this into our model. We'll do this by changing our W of t here and giving it an additional delay. So I'm going to call that W of t minus tau. And the reason that this is nice is because it allows us to tune which regime we're in. So if tau is positive, this means I have advanced warning. This means that my disturbance is hitting me with some delay. Now if tau is negative, this means I have delayed detection. Again, we can pose the same optimal control problem of trying to minimize the worst case amplification of a disturbance. And again, we can solve it analytically. And this is the expression. Now this looks pretty similar to what we saw earlier, with the exception of this red term here. And this red term here gives us qualitatively different behavior depending on whether we're in the advanced warning regime or in the delayed detection regime. So let's start by looking at how this cost function behaves in the advanced warning setting. So this is the case where I'm using vision. I get advanced warning of what's coming at me. What I'm plotting here is, again, this cost as a function of advanced warning. And I want you to notice that if I have sufficient advanced warning, as my advanced warning gets bigger, this cost is dominated by resolution error. And the optimal way to tune my nerve is to match the delay of my nerve to the amount of advanced warning that I get. Now again, this makes sense. Given that I have advanced warning, I'm going to take advantage of this fact to get as much information about the disturbance as I can until it hits me. And so we see here that as the delay gets bigger, as the amount of advanced warning gets bigger, I can take this cost all the way down to 0. Now, if we think about, if we look at the other setting, that of delayed detection, well, this is a completely different setting, right? And again, if we look at robustness, at how the cost evolves, we see that delay dominates our cost. And again, this makes sense. Because if I, let's say, hit a bump, I don't need to know exactly what kind of bump hit me. I need to know that a bump hit me, and I need to react to it. And so we see the delay, the effect of the delay gets worse and worse, and our resolution is constant. So we're providing coarse but timely information about what's happening. And so the design principle here is to really minimize delay at the expense of resolution. Okay, so this is good. This actually gives us insight into the behavior that we saw earlier. Going back to our trade-off space here, we now understand that the design principle that goes into building the optic nerve is one of maximizing resolution. I have advanced warning of what's going to hit me. That's what vision is used for. And so I'm going to maximize the resolution that I have. In contrast, the vestibular nerve is a reflexive system. And so it's operating in this regime of delayed detection. And so what I want to do is minimize my delay. And now, so what we have is a physiological, mechanistic explanation as to why we see this distribution of nerves in our system. Okay. So what I've shown you now is, so what I've just shown you is how we can use simple tools from control theory combined with simple models from neuroscience, simple physiological models, to get our hands on design principles that go into the human nervous system. Now what I want to spend the rest of the talk discussing is how we can extend these tools to large-scale systems. So how we can extend these tools to the systems that I motivated this talk with. Systems like the power grid or the internet that are composed of thousands or millions or even billions of nodes. When we go to these large systems, we're going to have to give up hope of getting our hands on these clean analytic expressions and rather focus on developing computational tools that will help us in analyzing and synthesizing these systems. So we've been looking at the nervous system at a very fine-grained detail. I want us to zoom out a little bit now and think about these things in more abstract terms again. So the paradigm that we've been talking about so far is one of centralized control, where we have one single system, one plant, one logically centralized controller that has global access to measurements and global control over our inputs. Now I hope that the discussion in the beginning of this talk makes it clear to you that this really isn't a viable approach for large-scale systems. We saw that delay hurts the performance of a system. And so you can imagine that if you have a big system like the power grid or the internet, and you had one single logically centralized controller, there'd be a huge amount of delay incurred in collecting global information. And so we also realized this problem in the control theory, in the control community. And so we shifted from centralized control to what's known as distributed control. So I'm just going to relabel my components here. I'm going to use C to denote the controller, A to denote the actuator, and S to denote the sensor, and P is my plant. And I'm going to shrink this down. And the reason I'm going to shrink this down is because now we're not thinking about a single plant and controller, but rather now we're talking about a lot of them. So we're thinking about tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, billions of them. And each of these different little subsystems, we can interconnect the different subplants. And I'm going to use these black lines to denote physical interconnections. So these are power lines in the power grid, for instance. And we're also going to allow the controllers to communicate and exchange information with each other. I'm going to use these red lines to denote the communication, the means by which these controllers exchange information with each other. And so the challenge in distributed control is how do we do all of these things that I talked about earlier? How do we synthesize controllers that minimize worst-case disturbance amplification, despite the challenge of coordination and communication and control? Now, you might notice that this picture is a little bit messy, and you can imagine that it gets even messier the larger the number of systems we're trying to analyze. So the way we typically draw this is something more like this, where we separate out the cyber network from the physical network. And now, even though I have these sensors and actuators on the side here in neat little boxes, you should really think of them as being distributed throughout the system. And each of these subcontrollers here, which are communicating with each other, have access and control over a subset of these sensors and actuators. And as I described, the challenge is really that of coordination, communication, and control between all these different subcontrollers. And our goal is computational tools to synthesize optimal controllers and to understand fundamental limits of robustness. Now, I can't talk about a computational tool without a small divergence into what's known as convex optimization. So we've implicitly been using optimization throughout this whole talk. And convex optimization is really convexity is really the watershed between something that's computationally tractable, something that we can solve in a computationally efficient manner, and something that isn't. So suppose I'm trying to just find the minimum value of a function f of x. If this function is convex, and that just means that in some high dimensional space, it looks like a bowl, then I can do this efficiently. Intuitively, this is just because I can do something like just walk downhill until I find somewhere flat, and I can be confident that this flat region corresponds to a global minimizer. This is in contrast to, say, a non-convex function that has these wiggles and bumps in it. So if I do the same thing of just walking downhill until I find a flat region on this function, I don't know if I'm at a local minima or a global minima. And so you can imagine, especially in the context of trying to identify fundamental limits, we really want to be in this convex regime. We want to really know that we're at the optimal value. Okay, so if we're after convex computational tools, tractable tools, what's the technical challenge here? The really fundamental challenge is one of information asymmetry. The fact that each subcontroller here only has access to a subset of the global system information. To illustrate these challenges, let's look at a simpler example, one where we just have two subsystems. And let's make this even more concrete. Suppose that one subsystem is a solar panel and the other is an electric vehicle. And suppose we plug them in together. Now we can, again, pose an optimal control problem here. Suppose that I want to synthesize a controller that keeps me at some desired operating point. But I don't allow these two controllers to talk to each other. Now it turns out, even in a simple system like this, even if I pick the dynamics and the cost function in a very simple manner, the resulting problem is non-convex. So if I allow physically coupled systems to interact with each other, but don't allow the controllers to communicate with each other, this is computationally hard. But you may be thinking, okay, wait, hang on, this isn't really fair. The systems are interacting with each other, but I don't let my controllers talk to each other. Well, you're on to something there. If I let my controllers communicate with each other, then maybe this helps. It turns out that under certain conditions, this actually gives us convexity. So let me explain to you very quickly what those conditions are. There are two delays that I can associate with this system. The first is what I'm going to call the propagation delay of the system. And this is just the amount of time it takes for the effect of a controller on the left, for instance, to be felt by the controller on the right. So I'm going to call that the propagation delay P. So this is the time it takes for the controller on the left's action to propagate through the actuator, the physical coupling, and to be detected on the right. Likewise, I can associate a delay to the communication between these two controllers. So I'm going to call this communication delay C. And now there's a very simple condition that gives me convexity. If my communication delay is less than or equal to the propagation delay of the system, then this optimal control problem is convex. I can solve this in a computationally tractable manner. Now this may seem somewhat abstract or impractical to impose this kind of delay, but it actually can be met by physical systems that we care about. So in the context of the power grid, if we lay down fiber optic cable in parallel with transmission lines, this condition is satisfied. In the internet, if I give control packets priority throughout the network, this condition is satisfied. And remarkably, if we look at the human nervous system, it looks like the delays of our nerves are actually tuned to ensure that this condition is satisfied. So this is a practically relevant condition that we can actually see in practice. So what we've seen is, despite the complexity of needing to do coordination, communication, and control across a cyber network, we actually get convexity. We get something computationally tractable if we have enough communication. But there's an underlying assumption behind this that we can't really ignore anymore, especially when we're thinking about really big systems like the power grid or the internet. And that's really the idea of, where does this cyber network come from in the first place? Where should I put my actuators? Where should I put my sensors? And how should I interconnect them? As is the theme of this talk, there's a trade-off that arises here. On the one hand, if the only thing I care about is performance or robustness or stability, then I want to overload my system, with as much actuation, sensing, and communication as possible. This gives me as much information about the system as possible and allows me to actuate it in as many places as possible. But as we've discussed, there's a cost associated with building these components. These are physical components. So what I'm really after here is a sweet spot, a trade-off between performance and architectural cost. So to illustrate these ideas and how we've actually tackled this problem, I want to introduce a toy model of the power grid. So I want you to think of each node in this graph, each little dot here, as, say, a power plant or a solar panel or an electric vehicle. The edges are going to denote the physical connection, direct physical coupling between these two subsystems. So think of them as power lines, for instance. And each of these nodes are going to be described by, say, voltage and current. And this is how they interact with their neighbors. And then I'm just going to randomly populate the parameters of the model. So this isn't a super realistic model, but it still gets the point across. Now I'm going to take this graph and I'm going to overlay it onto a heat map. So in a second I'm going to remove the graph, but I want you to keep in mind that each square patch of this heat map corresponds to, say, the voltage of one of these nodes. Okay. And we want to keep the voltage at 0. So these are deviations from a nominal set point that we specified. So the first response of this system that I want to show you is the open loop response. And so this is the natural reaction of my power grid, say if a lightning bolt zaps it in the middle. And you see here that this is an unstable system because this disturbance is amplified and spreads throughout the system. So what are we going to do? We're going to use control theory to close the loop. We're going to attach some sensors, which are going to provide my controller with some measurements that it's going to use to compute a control input to close the loop. And here again, you can think of the lightning bolt as striking in the middle. And now we see that the effect of this lightning bolt is really suppressed. Not a whole lot is happening. So we've done a good job in designing our controller. But what I'm not telling you, what's going on underneath the hood here, is that I have actuators everywhere. There are actually 800 actuators in this system. I'm assuming that I can control the voltage and current at each node. And so what we're going to try to do now is figure out how we can explore this trade-off space between performance and the number of actuators that we're using. So I'm going to introduce a few different architectures to show the importance of carefully choosing and placing actuators. I'm going to make a simplifying assumption, which is that I can instantaneously sense the state of the system everywhere and communicate this information with all the controllers, all the actuators in the system. This is a simplifying assumption only for the purpose of this example. And the method that I'll describe later can actually handle simultaneously designing sensing, communication, and actuation. So we've already seen the dense architecture, which is the best performance, which is actuators everywhere. And we've also already seen the open loop response, which is the use of 0 actuators, which gives us the worst performance, but is free to build. And now I'm going to show you three architectures that lie in between these two extremes of our design space. And the first one I want to show you is a co-designed architecture, where I simultaneously design where the actuator should go and how I should use them. And so we've gone down from 800 actuators down to 261. And here we see that the response is qualitatively, and we can quantify this, very similar to that of the dense architecture. So we get good performance at a moderate cost. Compare this to now, say, random actuation, where you see that there's poor performance at the same moderate cost. And just to really drive home the point that it matters where I put these actuators, and that if you do something really stupid, bad things could happen, here's the worst architecture we could come up with. And so what's going on here is that my actuators are actually placed along the edges. And so if a lightning bolt strikes in the middle, the only way these controllers can do anything is by introducing their own opposite disturbances to the system that propagate inward. This is really bad. You don't want to do this. Again, we're talking about trade-offs. So let's plot this in a little bit more of a graphically visual way. So on the horizontal axis, I'm plotting the number of actuators that I'm using. So the farther out to the right, the more actuation. And on the vertical axis, I'm plotting the disturbance amplification of the system. So the farther up I am, the worse I am. So I apologize because now ideal is in the lower left corner, whereas throughout the rest of the entire talk, ideal was up here. So just keep that in mind. And now what we would like to be able to do in an ideal world would be to identify fundamental limits. Given a fixed number of actuators, what's the best performance I can achieve? But the challenge here is that this design space is what's known as combinatorial. So if I have X actuators to place, if I was going to enumerate every possible architecture, I would have to look at 2 to the X possible architectures. So in my example that I started with, I had 800 actuators. This would involve enumerating 2 to the 800 architectures. That's way more than the number of atoms in the universe. Not going to work. So the right way to go about exploring this design space is through the use of what's known as co-design, where, again, I'm going to try to synthesize a controller that simultaneously minimizes my disturbance amplification and also penalizes the use of actuators. So you can think of lambda here as a knob. that I can turn to explore this trade-off space. So if I turn this knob down to 0, then I'll recover the dense architecture, right? I'm not penalizing the use of actuators, so I'm going to use all of them. If I turn it all the way up to infinity, then I'll recover the open loop architecture. I'm infinitely penalizing any actuator that I use. And so what we'd like to be able to do is turn this knob from 0 to infinity to be able to trace out this trade-off curve. But there's a catch. And the catch is this penalty here. These types of counting penalties that penalize the number of actuators are non-convex. So this stair-like function here is non-convex. I can find a flat region that doesn't correspond to the global minimizer. Now, fortunately, these types of problems, these types of counting penalties, arise in a broad range of areas of applied mathematics, most notably in structured inference and compressed sensing in the last decade. And so there's actually a standard trick to get around this challenge. And it's what's known as a convex relaxation. And a convex relaxation is just a fancy way of saying, I'm going to take this non-convex penalty and replace it with something convex that kind of looks like it. Now, I'm grossly oversimplifying things, and there's actually a principled way of doing this, and there's a notion of what the right convex relaxation is. But at a fundamental level, this is the idea. And so I can go from this non-convex penalty to a convex one, replace this non-convex penalty with its convex surrogate, and I get a computationally tractable way of exploring this trade-off space. But again, we're not quite done, because I'm not solving the problem that I originally started out with. I'm solving what's known as a relaxed version of it. So what we need to do is prove that this is actually still a good idea. Again, drawing on connections to structured inference, we're actually able to prove that solving this convex relaxation, this is a theorem, using this convex relaxation, good controllers that lead to small disturbance amplification, are actually easier to identify than bad controllers. And so this is really nice, because this tells us that if I'm going to use this convex relaxation, then I can be confident that the controller I'm getting out of it is one that leads to good performance. And so I can go back to this trade-off space here and turn the crank and be confident that I'm identifying a trade-off curve that's on or close to the true trade-off limits. Okay, so let's take a little breath here and summarize what we talked about today. The first thing we did was show that when we're designing technological systems, there are often trade-offs that need to be explored between performance and robustness. We introduced concepts from control theory, such as feedback and optimal control, to explore these trade-offs. We then showed that simple models, simple control theoretic models, combined with simple physiological models, could actually lead to deep insights into understanding plausible mechanisms behind the design of the human nervous system. And then finally, we touched upon some of the work that I've been doing in terms of extending these ideas to large-scale systems and the computational tools that arise in that context. What I want to end with is a really exciting direction of future work that we're currently exploring. So this has been the setup all day. I have my controller in feedback with my plant, and I'm given a set point and a class of disturbances, and I want to minimize the worst-case amplification. Now, I hope that at least somebody in the crowd was looking at this and thinking, okay, this is all nice, but where does this come from? Where do I even get my set point? Feedback is about keeping me at a set point. How do I pick this set point? And so I want to illustrate some of the theory that we've been developing that helps us answer this question with a very simple example. And it's that of drinking a glass of water. And specifically, I want you all to think about what you think about when you drink a glass of water. Now, this is a room full of Caltech people, so maybe this won't apply, but most people don't think about solving Lagrangian mechanics when they're drinking water to understand how the water is sloshing around. Right? They're thinking something simple. They're thinking maybe I want to drink a glass of water. And somehow, this gets translated into the low-level complex motion in our arms and our wrists, etc. And so we've been working on a theory that is centered around the notion of layering that explains how this happens. So you can think of conscious thought as a planning layer. Now, this planning layer is goal-oriented, and it operates on a simple virtual model. So I'm not thinking in terms of joint space and water sloshing around, but rather I'm thinking maybe in terms of position and velocity. And this planning problem generates a set point, which is then implemented by my reflex layer. And the reflex layer is really what we spent all day talking about today. This is feedback control that implements this set point, that implements the trajectory generated by my planning layer, and also gives me robustness to disturbances. And this could be either centralized or distributed. And so this is a really exciting development that we've been working on. And although I've motivated this by an application in sensorimotor control, I hope you can see how these same kinds of problems would arise in the context of, say, robotics or the power grid or the internet. And then what I want to leave you with is what I think is really the most exciting direction for future work, which is incorporating learning into the mix here. And specifically, can we talk about answering the following question? How do I go from being a beginner skier to an expert skier? And I have these two videos next to each other to really give you this striking visual of how different a beginning skier is relative to an expert one. I think a plausible way to think about the difference here is that a beginner is doing everything in their planning layer. They have to think about how they're going to turn their hip, where they're going to put the weight on their leg, and how they're going to move their arms. And this leads to this slow, clumsy, deliberate motion down the hill. In contrast, an expert has pushed most of this complexity down to their reflex layer. They've tuned their reflex layer to the task at hand. And so now their planning is much simpler. They're thinking, okay, I'm going to take this line down the hill, and I'm going to do a double backflip at the bottom. They're not thinking about how they're going to suppress the effect of each individual mogul down the hill, because they would not be able to do that. And so understanding how we can shift this complexity from planning to reflex, I think will give us deep insight into how humans learn, and will help us build intelligent robots, self-driving cars, power grids, and networks. So with that, I'd like to end with some acknowledgements. I'd like to thank my advisor, John Doyle, as well as my unofficial co-advisor, Venkat Chandrasekaran. Yoria Nakahira, who's a student in John's group, is responsible for a lot of the great work that you saw related to sensorimotor control. Seriously? Okay, well. Yuxiang Wang, who's here as well, who's in Mickey's group, has done a lot of excellent work in having these results scale to really, really big systems. So if you're interested in controlling systems with millions or billions of nodes, come talk to me or Mickey. And then finally, I'd like to acknowledge my favorite collaborator and my partner in crime, Vanessa. There's a little heart that should be popping up there. As well as my parents, Nick and Nadia, and my sister, Natasha. Of course, I also have to thank President Thomas Everhart and the Everhart Committee, as well as the Graduate Studies Office and the Caltech Graduate Student Council for making this lecture series possible, and all my sources of funding. And I'd like to end by saying that I just hope that today at least made you want to learn a little bit more about control theory. And you can leave here and look in your respective domains and identify places where feedback is happening, where fundamental limits are an issue. And John, myself, Mickey, Yorie, we're all really eager to collaborate. And with that, thank you for your time.